outstretched hand,
Hello
smiling.
and happy summer from the heat wave here in the Midwest. I'm really excited to be here for episode 7 of What is School Belonging? And today we get into some of my favorite topics, belonging, school belonging, intersections of being adopted, intersections of race, identity, heritage, language, faith, spirituality, and the adoptee experience. So I'm really excited that I got to talk to Dr. David McCarty-Caplan. David's a social work researcher, an educator, and consultant, and his work has centered on adoption, identity, and lifelong development and learning. David is a transracial adoptee born in Colombia, and he combines his own professional expertise with his lived experience and facilitates spaces focused on racial and cultural belonging. He's also the founder of Shades of Belonging, which is a research and community initiative exploring intersections of race, faith, and the adoptee experience. I was excited to talk to David today. I think you'll get a lot out of it around belonging and school belonging. I was able to ask him what he perceives school belonging can mean for children like him and for children like his own. We also discuss research, his work with adoptee support groups, and the unique challenges of navigating these spaces. So I want to thank David for being here and thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, share, comment, like, subscribe, share, do it all.
Anytime adoptees come into contact with doctors, if there's a weird practical necessity that pops up in the moment, and those questions carry their own significance. And then on top of that is the part that the doctors or often adoptive parents forget or don't give enough attention to, is that inevitably that brings up, at least in my mind, and I imagine most adoptees' minds, just the deep understanding that we don't have answers to certain questions, or we can't ask the right people to find the answers in those moments, which is when it comes to something hard like dyslexia or a health issue or something that is a challenge by itself, when you add on top of that now it's through this lens of grief and loss that maybe especially young people may not have words or names for, why would you ever go to a doctor? Like it gets in the way functionally of us taking care of ourselves,
That's thank you for saying that, because in my house, it's been, doctors don't know what they're talking about.
Yep.
I won't go. They haven't figured out X, Y, and Z. And you're right. I can think of every single time where it's like, what's the history of X, Y, and Z? And you can gently say, my kids are adopted, we don't have access, but you watch the doctor still take the big pen.
Yeah, for me, like, I think I'm generally okay with doctors, but I definitely have huge barriers with things around like blood draw and needles. Like it's just been a struggle for me. I think there are a lot of reasons for that, but the hard part that I've noticed lately, and again, like this is just looking back now on 45 years of like, why has this thing in life been a challenge, this instance and this instance? And like with the doctor piece, I get like angry when people have forms about what's your medical history and there's no opportunity to be like, each of these questions is bringing up stuff for me that nobody here is actually going to respond to in a way that meets my needs.
Mm-hmm.
And that's upsetting by itself. And then when I'm sitting there and like there's something as simple as needing a blood draw, and I get really nervous about that, and like you can see it in my body, like I do shakes and I like wiggle and I'm like kind of weird about it, and they're like, this is totally easy, like you're totally fine. And I know like traditionally normal people or whatever, there are people that struggle with blood draw, but like for me, something about the blood draw I realized is like it connects to my fear of mortality, which is I think connected to like I get worried that something about giving my blood is going to suddenly lead to me dying and I will lose my family. Like that's actually what's going on in my head when I do a blood draw. Yeah. And the times it goes well, people are like sitting with me and they're breathing with me and they're peaceful and they're warm, and that's so rare. And nobody has ever asked me why I get upset. They just are like, you should be calm. And I'm like, well, fuck you, I'm not. Of course I'm biased because I'm an adopted person who works in adoptee spaces now, and I'm a researcher, so I'm like constantly looking at stuff through a critical lens. So maybe I see things in a funky way, but the more I look at like any piece of my life that was a challenge or was a big part of life, it always is tied to adoption. There's nothing that I cannot tie to adoption. And I kind of feel like a broken record, and it makes me feel a little bit sad because I kind of wish that I couldn't make these connections all the time. Because again, back to that earlier thing of like, what parts of who I am are me and what parts are defense mechanisms or survival tactics trying to respond to the hurt and loss of my earliest existence. I wish I couldn't tie everything to that, but I can. And the more I do, the more it feels real. And I wish I didn't have to explain that to people all the time.
Yeah. Can I ask you a question? I wanted to land. I mean, it's going to land how it's going to land, but I want to explain it. So, when I hear you describe that, and this is probably my adoptive parent bias or maybe privilege of like, that is your story. You get to own it, and your separation from your biological family, who I know from social media that you've been able to be in reunion with. So I want to hear about that, but there's extreme sadness. Like I think about grief, and I think about this like Anderson Cooper version of grief where we're just crying all the time. And my own experience with grief, I had like traumatic, profound loss in my teenage years with a family member. Like sometimes you're laughing too. Like sometimes you're like, either this is so incredibly
so absurd.
That I have to laugh, or it was my sister who I lost her. Like she would have been laughing at me right now for being upset. Like you have, it's grief. I think there's a version of it, the Hallmark, or now the Anderson Cooper version, where it's just like, we just are in a puddle all the time. And I'm not taking, that's his experience, that's people's experience, but is there power, I guess, also in your story? Both owning it, of course, making those connections, but also, I'm not asking for the silver lining. I'm just saying like, my certain adults made decisions about me, but now in my 5th decade on Earth, I get to do something with it.
Yeah, I hear it. First off, I cannot imagine losing a sister that I was raised with. And I'm so sorry that you had to go through that, especially at a young age. Like that's deeply horrible. So I'm really sorry. That must have been very, very hard. And must continue to be hard. And it's so great also, and I don't mean to minimize the loss, but like, I love that I now know that about you and that you're like carrying her memory into other relationships. Like that's pretty cool. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. That's cool.
Thanks for saying that.
My sister's a big deal to me. So like, of course, that's where my mind goes. And if I lost her when I was a teenager, I'd be even more fucked up than I am now. So like
older sister or younger sister?
Older sister, 7 years older.
Yeah.
So, okay, to answer the question, so while it's hard that things often or always connect to adoption for me, I also like the fact that the lines do line up and the connections make sense. And when I look at increasing my own understanding of concepts related to adoption and loss and belonging and all these things I deeply care about, the more they line up and it feels like the study of and the science of these things actually is aligned with my lived experience. And then I get to talk to other adoptees and it aligns with their lived experience. Yeah, there's something awesome in that recognition. So it's like, yes, it's a lot of grief and loss and hurt, but I coach and counsel young adoptees these days. And it's pretty amazing to be able to share with them some connections around those things that they hadn't connected the dots on yet. And it sucks that I'm like giving name or structure to their grief. because that grief exists, and I wish they didn't have to go through that.
Mhm.
But there is something beautiful about understanding yourself a little bit more. I was just working with a young adoptee who I mentor, and he just had his birthday, and I talk a lot about birthdays with adoptees, and I just wrote a blog on it recently, and it's a pretty significant moment for adoptees, and I never understood why I didn't like my birthday so much. And I certainly didn't understand it at 18.
Mhm.
And so now I'm 45, and I get to have a conversation with a young man who says that he's never liked his birthday, and he always feels sad on his birthday, and he never really understood why, never really thought about it. And now we've had 2 long conversations about how this might connect to adoption and how he's not alone. Like, this is actually a thing for
Mhm.
us. And I'm really sorry that his birthdays are hard. And I'm also pretty stoked that he had an opportunity to connect with me, and we had time to talk about it. And then
Yeah.
his birthday passed, and I was able to check in with him afterward, and he told me what sucked about it, and I got to just be with him in that moment. And it just felt good to, like, honestly, it feels like it's healing a little bit of my own inner child stuff to be able to pass on some of that knowledge, you know. Now he doesn't have to wait till he's 30 to dig in on that, you know.
Yeah. I think, and I very much appreciate your answer. In an ideal world, families would remain intact no matter what.
I don't know. I kind of feel like, yeah, I guess maybe in an ideal world, there wouldn't be adoption. I don't know that there's a world that won't have adoption. I just think we can do so much better when adoption needs to happen or has already happened. And so, like, I get really excited, honestly, when I meet adoptive parents like yourself that are just putting in the time with great care and love and concern to figure out how to work on improving the hand that we're dealt. And it's a hard question. Like, there are people I know that are very clearly like, oh, we need to abolish the whole system. And it's not that I disagree with that. I also just get really faced with the practical challenges of what we're dealing with now. And like, that
Mhm.
won't invisibilize the adoptive families that currently exist, you know,
Mhm.
and it won't take away my experience, you know, like, great for maybe the future, right? Maybe.
Mhm.
But there's a lot of other pieces to fill in. So, like, yeah, I don't know. That's a really hard thing. I don't know if I feel very strong about where I sit with that. You know, I think
Mhm.
I also feel like my adoption shit is wrapped up in that, because then I'm like, oh, now if I say that stuff out loud, people are going to think I'm ungrateful, you know, like, and
Mhm.
that's just messed up that I feel that way, you know?
Yeah, but one of the things that I'm trying to tease out is sort of which of these things, when you're talking about being grateful, being thankful, you mentioned, I think before we started recording, like sometimes mimicking or parroting the adult who's in charge, like, and I'm trying to tease out, like, when is that just the trauma response? When is that the fawning, fleeing, freezing, flight, fight response? And when is it stuff that all human beings do? Or like,
Yeah.
we haven't gotten into religion and spirituality, but like, like, where your adoptive parents are Ashkenazi?
Yes. My dad comes from Romanian descent, I believe. And my mom, I think it's a little less clear. But yeah, my mom didn't know she comes from Jewish lineage, or she came from Jewish lineage until she was in her grown-up years. Like, it got lost, and her family was actually, her dad's side was Mormon. So, but her
Oh,
mom's side actually turns out they were Jewish, but they had
interesting.
hidden it. They were hidden
Yeah.
Jews, and but she didn't realize that till many years later. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
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 some of
yeah,
that,
white Jewish folk, you know.
right? Some of that conformity,
Right.
yeah. We need to survive here. We need to become white. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so thinking about classroom schools, and it can, my research is K-12, but I say, like, not much seems to change beyond there. In fact, many times I hear I hear experiences are even worse because interactions with professors and in classrooms become less frequent, just even time-wise and contact-wise. So that question of belonging in learning institutions, like,
Yeah.
I know there's not a pack to answer for it, but how do you perceive as like, what do you perceive as like powerful practices for kids who are adopted in schools? Like, what are your memories of it? I know you're a parent too. What do you see working for your own kids, or what do you wish you had?
I think it played a role at every part of my educational journey. Yeah, I mean, there's so many things to dig into. One of my first memories of school was directly related to this. It's a story I've told maybe once before publicly, but basically I was in second grade and we were doing this like exercise of like writing on like big, big line paper, right? And I don't know what the prompt was, but many years down the line, like in my 30s, my mom, who saved everything, which is to her credit, like thank God she had these things for me to mull over now. But it was a piece of paper with like my childlike handwriting, which hasn't improved much since then. And it was like, practicing learning how to write. And what I wrote was like, I was adopted from, I think I said Bogota or something. I was adopted from Bogota. I don't know who my mother is. I don't know if she's still alive. And that's all it says. And then there's like a drawing, like a crayon drawn picture on top of that sentence of like a baby in a bassinet and a baby being taken out of a bassinet by, I'm unclear about who the figures are, but by a grown up and another person, and like the baby's crying. And I think it's like obviously depicting either the separation part or the adoptive parents receiving me, right? But what I wrote, like, and it was probably like, write a sentence about your family, and that's what I wrote as like an 8-year-old. And so it was very clearly on my mind, and I'm writing about it. And the part that trips me out, and it makes me very emotional. So like, I'm just like, I cry a lot. So forgive me.
Tears are a sign of strength. I learned that.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. The part that trips me out now is my teacher wrote on it. First of all, there's like a sticker, like, good job, and my teacher wrote like, aren't you so lucky to have the family you have now? And I remember that teacher, like she was an outstanding teacher. And another memory I have from that same year was, it was my first year in that new school. Like we'd just moved to Maryland from Ann Arbor. And so I was a new kid, and another kid had, found out I was adopted or something and said something kind of nasty, like, oh, you don't know who your parents are or something like that. And, I was upset. I think I told my parents about it. My parents called the teacher, and the teacher the next day, she did this cool thing where she would do like a caricature art of a student every week or something. And so she chose me to be the student that week. And she was pointing out like what makes me beautiful in my difference, and shared that with the class, and had me at the front of the class and was drawing me. And it was really lovely and honoring and felt warm. And then she kind of did this thing where she was like, what other differences do we have in this classroom? And she was just like kind of honoring people's differences in a way. And I remember that. And I remember feeling like my teacher had my back that day. And that was really cool. And at the same time, that's the same person that wrote like, aren't you so lucky that you have the family that you have now? And like, I look at what I wrote and I'm like, that kid needed somebody to talk to. And I don't think I ever wrote about being adopted again after that until I was in my 30s. It just makes me think like what I wish for all students is what I wish for adoptees, like it's what I wish for you when you lost your sister, like school should be a place where when hard things happen, we're treated with warmth and openness and honesty, and that we listen to kids when they're telling us that something's hard. I feel like I didn't get listened to. I was like, I look at it and I'm like, I was screaming,
Yeah, and you were brave to put that down too. I think that was a risk you took, I think, and that um it's interesting because I try to use like for teaching teachers practical things they can do. One of the things is attunement. So she picked up what you put down, and then the next day she did something really warm. But the other part is curiosity. And in that moment, she came with her predisposed ideas of, the Daddy Warbucks, like, aren't you lucky?
Yep.
How she was interpreting it was more about herself.
Yeah. I think for me, like when I get to the conceptual connection of that experience as an example and what I hope for in building spaces of belonging, it's a big part of it is like, can you be your authentic self in a space? That's a huge part of it. And and this gets to like Gabor Mate's work, which I just adore. To be your authentic self often feels like you're at risk of threatening the relationships around you through your authenticity. And what that told me, and what other instances tell me, and what a lot of adoption related and childhood trauma related writing and science tell us, is that if you try to get something off your chest that's very true and real, and people's response is to not hear it and kind of suggest maybe be quiet about it, you're gonna choose holding on to the relationship over sharing the honesty of what your experience is. And I think that's the worst thing that can happen for an adoptee, because then it's that gratitude piece. It's like, I tried to share something and the response was, you should feel lucky. And I'm like, I'm telling you, my heart is broken because I lost my mother, right? And when I shared that, the response was, you should feel lucky, which is, you should not feel sad. And so that's one of many instances in which I received the message of my authentic experience of sadness is dangerous. And if I express it, people will tell me to be quiet. So in order to hold on to my relationships, I need to be quiet about that part.
Yeah, you learned something very structural in that instance. I don't know if you can remember this far back, but even when you put the two examples near each other, if it were right now and I was trying to unpack this with a teacher or a student or their family, like, did one undo the other? Like, were you able to, when you were celebrated by your classmates, I'll just say it doesn't sound like there was like an apology of action, like anything restorative from the first one.
No, they're just two separate instances. It's like one doesn't erase the other. One does not diminish or increase the other. They just both are.
Yeah.
And I think that the dominant, unfortunately, if I had to like weigh out the dominant experiences, it was like the received message was, and this gets back to like my parents being academics, like the way they measured or saw my success was often in the form of academic excellence. And it's not a coincidence that I went to get my master's and got my PhD and got into research. Like, that's the part that's making me crazy now. It's like, I love that stuff, or I learned to love that stuff because that's what made me feel safe with my academic parents, right? And so, like, what if I didn't love that stuff? What if I wanted to do other things? Or there were other parts of my life that just didn't get celebrated. And being good in school was safety in a way. I was capable in school-based settings. I could pay attention. I could reflect information really well. I was a good speaker. I was good socially. Like, I learned how to navigate school professionally. And I went through my PhD to like never leave that environment where I got affirmation for being the way I was. But not everyone has that. And so a part of me is like, I leaned into that because I could. And also, it's what I knew from my parents would be the way they would receive me as good. And I think, and I don't blame them because they just are who they are. But I think a big part of it was like, if I'm not good in school, they won't love me. And that was reflected in many times when I like didn't make the grade or that kind of thing.
Yeah. It's
which
also
sucks.
how we've set up schools in society. Our
Yeah.
version of school is still so specific
Yeah.
to opportunities that don't really exist anymore post
Yeah.
school for kids. So
That's very true. Yeah. Well, and like I knew other adoptees as a kid, and many of them really struggled in like traditional spaces, particularly learning spaces, and they like weren't doing as well in school or were getting into trouble more in those spaces. And I'm like, man, I got lucky because I could do that thing. But a lot of adoptees, through no fault of their own and for good reason, like really struggle in traditional school-based settings.
mhm.
And I know now that those spaces were not designed to meet the needs of people with complex trauma, and they continue to not be designed to meet that need. So like, I love talking about the way adoptees and people of color more broadly, and humans even more broadly, have so many different forms of intelligence and greatness,
Mhm.
and what those can look like and how they don't actually fit into our school systems that often. And I hope, and I know so many people that have non-academic excellence, they're told that they're not smart, or they receive that message. And like, what an unfortunate state of affairs for young people to be in, where there's this like very finite box of what good is,
Yeah.
and many people don't fit it,
Yeah.
Well, and if you're thinking about what belonging looks like in schools, like from a researcher standpoint, I feel like so much on belonging is measured off of very limited ways of asking that question. It's like, do you feel a sense of belonging? And it's like yes or no, or like a scale of 1 to 5 or whatever.
Mhm.
And I just think there's so much more in the concept of belonging that needs to
Mhm.
be explored, because like, it's not like I can answer that question, sure, but it's also important to know, like, do I feel like I can be my authentic self? Like I said, that's a
Mhm.
big one, right?
Mhm.
Do I feel like relationships in these spaces are what I want them or need them to be? Do I
Mhm.
feel like I can express my opinions
Mhm.
without risk? Do I feel like I'm treated equally or fairly as others? Like there are all these facets to me that scientifically make up the concept of belonging,
Yeah.
and all of them play a part in school-based settings. And it's beyond just saying, do you feel like you belong here? Right.
Yeah. Getting a little bit into being a transracial adoptee, being in reunion with your family. I know you're not necessarily going back to your K-12 years, but how do you talk through when you, especially I guess when you talk through that authenticity, like being a person of color in a white family and being adopted? Like, was that something you teased apart when you were little? Was it all in one, all in your body, all at the same time, always? Like, where was your vigilance around what part of me might be standing out here or there?
I think it was always clear to me that like the race or cultural identity piece was a big part of it. I mean, the first indicator is like my parents don't look like me. Like my dad's 6'2" and white, and I'm like 5'5" and not like brownish,
Mhm.
and it was kind of, and they always told me, like I always knew that I was adopted from Colombia. So it was always in my mind that I was out of the lineage that I was born into. My family traveled a lot when I was a kid, and to many Latin American countries. And so I had a lot of experience seeing Spanish speaking communities with brown skin, predominantly brown skin, and facing a lot of like poverty, like in developing nations as a young person, as like a visitor, which was kind of like, it was very important to my upbringing. And that's like when I went to school originally, it was to go into anthropology. And it was from those experiences, which I think is tied to adoption, of course. So I was always aware that, particularly when I visited those places, that those were closer to home, because like locals would speak to me and be like weirded out that I didn't know how to respond in Spanish, Like the first phrase I learned how to say in Spanish was, I don't speak Spanish, I was adopted, right? And that's messed up. That like the first phrase I learned in my language, my birth language, was to let people know that about me. And it's because as like a 10-year-old walking in Mexico, kids would come talk to me, or I'd be playing in an arcade in Guatemala when I was 12 and kicking people's butts in Street Fighter, and they're like mad at me and speaking in Spanish, and I'm like, sorry bro, like I don't know how. And they're like, but why not? Like you look like me. And other kids don't know what that's like, right? And then I would come home and my community was like a 90% white community. And so in foreign countries, it was very clear to me that I didn't quite fit. And then in the white Jewish community I was raised in, it was also pretty clear to me that I didn't fit. And so like one of the first things as a teenager in Jewish community that I would do as like a defense mechanism is I would introduce myself as like, I'm David, the only Colombian adopted Jew you'll ever meet. And I said that as a joke because it felt a lot better to preemptively put that out there so that I didn't get the, oh, like, why are you here? You know, or like, how are you Jewish? Or like, oh, you don't look Jewish, or any of that shit. What happened before that is like, if adoption came out, they'd be like, oh, so you're not really Jewish, right? So there's all this like, I don't fit in, I don't fit in, I don't fit in. And I was so concerned about pleasing other people, and like the discomfort that people would feel if I expressed sadness around it was too much. So I turned it into a joke that I would start conversations with, just to not have to deal with it organically coming out, and to like make people smile and take negative energy out of it, right? But now I look at that and it's just sad. Like it's just sad that like as a 12-year-old in my home community, that's how I introduce myself. And as a 10-year-old or a 12-year-old in Latin America, I had to tell people why I don't speak their language. So like my social interactions at that age were grounded in awareness of me not fitting in racially or culturally.
So it's hard to find in the adoption research that there's lots of stuff about like loss, all of the family loss, all of the family event losses, or not having family at rituals or celebrations, but the loss of privacy. Really, it's just not mentioned much. Like the layers of that, like I was forced to come out, like I was forced to come out just to be, is so profound and not talked about. And that happened, I'm sure, at the moment of separation. Like people were telling your story before you, I'm guessing, I know in my family, people were telling my kid's story to one another before they were sentient.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And it's so weird too. Like it gets put into family lore. Like when I was 3 and 4, I lived in India because my mom was doing her dissertation. So whatever. We were living in India. And so, you know, that's when like kids start talking and they start having memories. And I don't remember this, but there's a very, very famous family story where apparently we were walking down some street in India and I was like a brownish little child, and some locals saw me walking with my parents and talking with them. And they came up to my parents and they're like, wow, where did you find an Indian boy who speaks English so well? Right. And like that story, that little interaction is something my family has shared hundreds of times over the years as like a cute family anecdote. But I look at that and I'm like, it's another example of other people receiving me as not of them. And then it being public that I'm not of them. And people trying to figure out why I exist in the space. And I have to receive that. And then for the rest of my life, the story is about me not looking like my parents.
Yeah. Being objectified. Yeah. Being an oddity or a curiosity. Yeah. I mean, the humanity, like the depths of your humanity in that moment. And then every time it's being retold is like totally flattened. Your experience there is flattened.
And I get it. I get that that's a story that my family would tell again. But then I'm like, it would be different if I was old enough to be like, there's a part of this that reminds me that I lost my family, you know? And every time that story is told, I'm like, that just reminds me I lost my family, like really early, you know?
Yeah. But it decenters you. It takes your agency away of like, when that person came up, what did you actually feel? That for a 3 or 4-year-old, that could be really terrifying. Like, you're telling me I don't belong to these people? Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. I talk a lot in racial equity spaces about the minority tax as like a concept, like the added burden people of color have to carry either to get through a situation or to educate or to respond to situations that have to do with race or racism. And I feel like that concept also applies to adoptees. And my stories of like how I introduced myself or how I had to walk through Latin America or being a little kid in India, it's like there's always this added weight where I have to navigate social complexities in a way that other people don't have to or don't see. And so they don't know that trying to figure out where I fit actually puts a burden on me to then have to explain or out myself or emotionally handle whatever hardships are coming up, you know?
Yeah. And as a kid, I'm sure you were doing all of that labor too, which is why I think sometimes adopted kids, I use the term looked after, shut down in school. Like, it's exhausting to always perform as someone else and try to understand all the dynamics that are placed when, like, schools are, you said they're not built for adopted kids, or you used a great phrase like that.
Well, like there's some blatant examples that I even noticed with my own kids. So I have a 12-year-old and a 10-year-old now. And when they were going through different ages or classes, there are things that I'm like, oh, that's upsetting to me that you have to do that. Like the family tree stuff, you know, like asking a second grader to work on a family tree. My kids came home and they're like, yeah, we're doing this thing and they want to know about our family. And I'm like, okay. And for me, it's secondary because I'm like, well, at that point, I don't think I'd been in reunion yet. So I'm like, well, I know I'm Colombian, but that's about it on my side. But I could talk about my adopted family. Does that count? Is that what, you know? But when I was a kid, and as a grown-up too, there were multiple times, even in my master's program, we did this kind of family tree art, social worky type project. And mine ended up being like a tree that had no roots. And I remember another time I did it where half of my tree was dead and half of my tree was my existing knowledge of my families. And these are things that adopted kids regularly have to go through.
Oh, yeah, still. Yeah.
Or like, even like, what does your daddy do? Or what does your mommy do? Which has so many problems just generally as like a question. But for adopted kids, maybe they can answer those questions in the form of what their adoptive family does. But it leads to then to being like, well, I also don't know this other thing, right? Maybe they don't share it. I don't know. But I know a lot of adoptees that had those questions and they're like, yeah, I remember being upset about that. Or I remember coming home with the family tree assignment and just being like, you know, yeah. Well, and I also recognize that teachers need to do what like they got to do what they're going to do. But if a kid is having something come up, like, again, it's like me writing that stuff as a second grader. If in a perfect scenario, that teacher would have told me like, wow, that sounds like a hard memory, or that sounds like you're really going through some feelings about this. Like, what is that like? Or like, what's coming up for you? Also, there's so little time. Our systems of schools are built around white supremacist, like, systems of false urgency and sticking to specific timelines. And there's no room for process. It's all product. And I'm like, whether you're adopted or not, if there's a kid that's going through some shit, I wish our teachers would respond with a pause and a breath and let's honor what's coming up. That's hard, you know, and that's more work, but it's actually what will make a kid feel like, oh, when I'm in school, people actually care if I'm struggling with something.
Yeah.
They're not going to just pass it off as like, okay, on to the next kid.
Will you spend some time talking about Shades of Belonging, what you're doing with Shades of Belonging, how it came to be?
As a researcher, I feel like so many people assume research is objective. And I'm like, oh, I just needed to do this project to explore pieces of my own experience that I had been terrified to explore before. And I had an opportunity as an independent researcher to build a project that really was where I needed to be. And what was beautiful about that is it scratched that itch for me But then in the process of doing that project, which was basically asking the questions around where do adoptees see themselves as far as having a sense of belonging in Jewish community, I was able to answer the questions that I always wanted to know, and found out I wasn't actually as isolated or alone. I wasn't the only Colombian adopted Jew people would ever meet. I wasn't the only one that was scared to talk about this. I wasn't the only one that felt out of place in their synagogue or their youth group or their Sunday school or whatever. In fact, most of us really don't feel a sense of belonging in those spaces. The statistical side of that showed that only 25% of adoptees of color feel a strong sense of belonging in Jewish community, which means that 75% don't, bro.
When I saw that on your website, I was like, wow.
Yeah, and that's wild. And then on top of that, of adoptees of color, in my study, I think it was like 65% have experienced racism or racial tension or discrimination in Jewish settings as well. And I think it was almost 46% have experienced racism in their own homes, in their families. The research got me excited because it allowed me to explore things that I think I knew were relevant to me. And then it was just validating and troubling to see that they're very relevant for pretty much every other adoptee I talked to. And then I did like the interviews with adoptees. I did 30 interviews and I had 115 people respond to the quantitative survey. In the interviews of the 30 people I talked to, every single one of them said they'd never been asked about the intersections of their Jewish identity and their adopted identity. And I'm like, never? And they were so excited to talk because nobody had ever approached them. And also I lived it. So they were like, oh, it feels good to talk to you. So there's so many angles to this that felt really exciting. And there were a lot of people that had really strong relationships with their adoptive families, which is great, that were really, really seeking to be part of Jewish community. And there were a lot of people that had really hard relationships with their parents and their Jewish communities. And so it really also was like a really diverse group of Jewish adoptees, but there were a lot of trends across, you know, the group as a whole. And it's an interesting time to be doing research on Jewish communal identity because there's, in my opinion, just such great sense of risk and threat to Jewishness right now in the United States. And so to add on top of that, this like added sense of racial discomfort or racial identity or cultural loss or, you know, seeking belonging in a community that also feels like it doesn't honor you. It's like, why are we keep going back to this abusive relationship, you know? But then the crazy shit is all the people that I talked to helped me feel more Jewish than I've ever felt because I found the Jewish community where I could really be myself. And that's kind of amazing. Like I've been a part of Jewish communities of color now for 5 or 6 years. And it's a large part of what has sustained me since leaving my academic job is now working in Jewish communal spaces and being part of like Jutina, which is a Latin Jewish organization that I'm on staff for, has meant the world to me. And finding the Jews of Color Initiative, which funded my research that cares about the questions that I wanted to ask. I'm like, somebody will fund me to do these things. Like, and now it's all like, I love my Jewish identity. And it's wonderful to have found Jewish spaces that recognize the challenge of being our type of Jew in the Jewish spaces, right? So it's very complex. And then on top of all of that, like when it comes to questions of Jewish identity or risk or anti-Semitism or questions on Israel, there's added complexity and risk around if I critique Jewishness in a particular way, for some people, is that going to then reinforce in their mind that I'm not Jewish? So there's this added risk of like, let's say I'm critiquing the state of Israel's practices. And I know that even unadopted people that are Jewish that do that are like, oh, you're a self-hating Jew or you're not Jewish enough or whatever. But for an adoptee who has been scared of being told they're not Jewish enough or, oh, you're not really Jewish like when I was a kid, it's just another layer of risk to, again, speak my authentic perspectives or risk the relationship in the community that I want to have. Whether, you know, in the example of pro or, you know, critical of Israel, that's one of the tensest pieces. also as a Latin Jew, like there's a lot of questions around immigration and where Jewish kind of sentiment or Jewish American politics lie on immigration. And there's a lot of tensions there, right? And so it's a really big deal to me to have Jewish community members that are very expansive in how they approach immigration rights stuff. And it's very important to me in Jewish spaces that people are really willing to have hard conversations around the state of Israel that allow for discourse without rejection. And that's incredibly hard right now, because I also recognize that many Jewish people essentially are having what I see as like intergenerational trauma kind of come up in response to things like October 7th and rising anti-Semitism, which is all very real, right? So it's not unfounded, but I feel like when we're activated in a trauma response, we're initially going to, and kind of until we get out of that, we're going to be very defensive. And it doesn't allow us to be our expansive, best human selves when we're worried about our own kind of existential threat, right? And so I feel like the conversations that I really value are really limited in Jewish spaces in this moment, because most Jewish communities feel very unwilling to kind of dig in on the hard stuff right now.
Yeah. I mean, you captured so much complexity in that.
Well, the part that I want to dig into so much more in the future is I've been working on trying to understand belonging in a variety of spaces, particularly adoptee and Jewish spaces, and the connections that has now to really hard pieces of adoptee journeys, like the frequency with which suicide ideation or suicidality occur. Like, I now see that terrifying stat as directly related to how belonging is felt by adoptees prior to those hard moments, right? And I recently was listening to a podcast that was digging in on this topic, and they basically boiled down to the idea that like belonging as a concept is actually a manifestation of love. So like, how do we love each other better? And so it's fascinating to me to think about something like non-belonging and recognizing that over time is deeply connected to addiction and maladaptive behavioral patterns and mental health struggles and suicidality, all like the worst case scenario stuff. And all of that is potentially a reflection of how much love, essentially, people of color or adoptees feel or don't feel through time.
Well, I think to go back to the teachers, as you're so lucky, so, you know, in school, if we all have the same T-shirts or we all have the same welcome, the rainbow, not pride, but like just like the rainbow welcome, everyone's welcome here, and I'm supposed to worship you because you put minimal effort into something. And I agree with you, like teachers have to do what they have to do, but it's like, by you telling me I belong doesn't make me feel like I belong, but you're going to keep hammering that. What's the other thing on depression? Like, it's fear or emotions turned inward. Like, how many lives have you had to negotiate and push down?
It's that burden piece again. It's like, it's an unseen, often disenfranchised grief or burden. And I actually really sympathize with that feeling. And also, I never want anyone I love to have to go through that, you know.
David, thank you so much. Will you do a shout out? Tell anyone where they can find you online?
Of course. Yeah. Shadesofbelonging.com. That's where a lot of my adoptee specific related stuff is happening. And we're building really exciting things. I'm currently doing a community circle for Jewish adoptees of color that are really wonderful groups of people that we're hoping to bring together in community and build something for our future, which is our latest project. And we're also working on developing a research project to explore the experiences of Christian adoptees of color as kind of a parallel study to the Jewish experience, because I think a lot of this goes beyond Jewish communities, which would be really exciting. And also I work with Jutina Eco, which is an amazing organization dedicated to Latin Jewish community and belonging and culture. So people can find me there.
Awesome. And I know you're doing a group with Dr. Adam Anthony soon too. I saw that.
Yeah, that's with Doctrine Mosaic, which is another organization I work with, which is fantastic. And I'm really excited about that. That's a men's group, which is pretty cool.
That sounds awesome. Well, thanks for all you're doing in the universe and the
Same to you.
adoptee space. And awesome talking to you, and look
Yeah.
forward to many more conversations.
Indeed, man. Thank you for this time.
An outstretched hand, smiling eyes, comfort.